Speaker, and I'm pleased to be able to rise and offer my thoughts on C-21 Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'm pleased to be able to rise and offer my thoughts on C-21 at third reading. And I say that with a bit of amazement because I can't believe we've actually made it to third reading. This bill received first reading in this House in May 30th of last year. We got through second reading in fairly short order, but it's at committee stage, Madam Speaker, where things really got lost and all hell broke loose, so to speak. Things were actually going quite well. I remember participating as the NDP's public safety critic. We had scheduled 8 witness meetings to look at the first version of this bill. Things were going along quite well. There was some disagreements around the table, but there wasn't any of the kind of friction that suggested there would be a major catastrophe in the making. Of course, that all changed in November when we arrived at the clause-by-clause portion of the bill. Before that meeting started, of course, every party was responsible for reviewing the witness testimony, reviewing the briefs that had been submitted, working with legislative drafters to put together our amendments. And of course, once those were submitted to the clerk, as is the normal course of things, the clerk then distributed it to all committee members. It was quite a surprise when we saw just how big that amendment package was and just how greatly expanded the scope of the bill was going to be. Most of the amendments were coming from the government, and there were a couple in particular which just completely sent the committee off its rails. They landed on our lap at the 11th hour. It was obvious that there had been no warning to committee members. I feel like the Liberal members of the committee who were introducing those amendments on behalf of the government, they read them into the record, but I don't think they actually really had a very good clue as to the monumental nature of the amendments. It was clear that the amendments were not backed up by any witness testimony because the significant nature of how they were changing the bill, we as committee members had never had the opportunity to question witnesses on the bill taking that shape or form. So that completely derailed things. So that started in November of 2022, and it is only just recently that, Mr. Speaker, that the committee stage of the bill was actually finally able to complete its job. And that's an incredible amount of time for one committee to be occupied with one single bill. I mean, public safety and national security, if you look at the mandate of that committee, it is one of our most important committees. It is responsible for reviewing the policies and legislation of multiple different agencies, whether it's the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, the Office of the Correctional Investigator, the RCMP, and there are 2 other bills. Bill C-20, which is going to provide an important oversight body for both the RCMP and the CBSA. Bill C-26, which is going to seek to upgrade our cybersecurity infrastructure. Both of those bills have been held up because of the shenanigans that have been going on with C-21. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have been listening to the debate all day yesterday when this bill was going through report stage, and now today when it is going through third reading. And unfortunately, because of some of the speeches that are going on in this House, there is a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of people have the wrong idea of what is actually included in this bill. I hear my Conservative colleagues, they do make a big deal in their speeches about standing up for hunters, farmers, and Indigenous communities, and I take no fault with that. I proudly stand here and say the same thing. The reason why it's troubling, Mr. Speaker, is because it's alluding to something that is actually not in the bill. Mm-hmm. And that allusion is that for hunters, for farmers, and for Indigenous communities, your rifle or shotgun, if it's semi-automatic, is going to be prohibited by this bill. And let me clearly say this slowly and for the record, that is not the case. Mm-hmm. C-21 is not going to do that. If you have a current make or model of a rifle or shotgun, you are licensed and legally own that firearm, after this bill receives royal assent, you will continue to be able to use that. That is a fact. And so far, when I've brought it up in questions, my Conservative colleagues have been unable to refute that, Mr. Speaker. I have challenged multiple Conservative MPs to name me one rifle or shotgun that is going to be prohibited by C-21. Every single instance, they have deflected and swerved away to go back to comfortable talking points because they can't name it. They cannot name it. And I'll tell you why, Mr. Speaker, because I'm not reading Conservative talking points. I'm going to actually read from the text of the bill. So the new section that is going to add to the definition of what is a prohibited firearm, it mentions that it's something that is not a handgun. It discharges centerfire ammunition in a semi-automatic manner, was originally designed with a detachable cartridge magazine with a capacity of 6 cartridges or more, and this is the key point that everyone seems to skip over, is designed and manufactured on or after the day on which this paragraph comes into force. That is the key part. So current makes and models are not going to be affected by C-21. Future makes and models that come into the market after this bill receives royal assent, yes, they will be affected. But for current owners, you are not going to be affected by C-21. Now, Conservatives will then seek to muddy the waters even further. Like, I've heard a lot of reference to the Firearms Advisory Committee. They say, well, you know, the minister's going to bring this back and he's going to staff it with Liberal appointees, and they're going to make suggestions about what firearms should be prohibited, and then they're going to act on that. Well, I've got a news flash for my Conservative colleagues. That is a power the government already has. They don't need a Firearms Advisory Committee. I would direct my Conservative colleagues to the existing section 84.1 of the Criminal Code. It says right there that the government can change the definition of what a prohibited firearm, and I'll quote, any firearms that are prescribed to be a prohibited firearm. Prescribed is the key word there, Mr. Speaker, because that means it can be done by cabinet decree. And if they don't believe me, how did the government get the authority in May of 2020 to issue an order in council? 1,500 makes and models, done through the Canada Gazette, done under existing powers. So all of this ballyhoo over a Firearms Advisory Council, all of the hoopla that we've heard in this House about the dangers of that council coming into being, a complete red herring, smoke and mirrors. It's a power the government already has. And in fact, I would rebut them on that argument, saying that if the minister currently has that power to do so unilaterally through an order in council cabinet decree, is it not a good thing to at least have an advisory council to talk to the minister about maybe that's not a good idea? I mean, if we can in fact ensure that the advisory council has Indigenous representation, has representation from the hunting community, has representation from the sport shooting community, in my mind, that's a good thing. So, I mean, I'll let them continue saying that, but they know they cannot argue with me on those facts because, again, I'm reading from the bill and I'm reading from existing provisions of the Criminal Code. So if they're going to try and muddy the waters, they can try and argue their way out of it, but you can't change the facts, Mr. Speaker. Now, I want to turn to something more positive, to the airsoft community. You know, last summer, I had the pleasure of visiting the Victoria Fish and Game Club. And I don't know if you've been to Vancouver Island, Mr. Speaker, but in the middle of my riding is the Malahat Mountain. So it's the big mountain that separates the Cowichan Valley from the city of Langford and the whole West Shore. And, it's the traditional territory of the Malahat people. But on top of there is where the Victoria Fish and Game Club is, a beautiful property. And right beside it, they have an amazing forest setting for their airsoft games. And I went out there with one of my constituency assistants on a weekend, They invited us to come and see a match, and we got to don the referee uniform so we could walk out in the middle of a pitched battle. I think one of my constituency assistants accidentally got shot, but it was so fun to see just like how much fun these players were having, and to talk to them about how passionate they were with their sport, to really understand that like this is more than a hobby for them. This is something that allows them to get out into the great outdoors with their family and their friends. And they said, we're really worried about C-21 because of the section in the bill that is basically going to turn our airsoft rifles into prohibited devices. And so I invited some of them, I think with other colleagues around the committee table, to come to committee to submit briefs to say their piece. And I have to say that to the representatives of the airsoft industry, the manufacturers, and to the players' associations, you did yourselves proud. You made a good argument. You convinced minds around the committee. You did what is done in a democratic system. You fought for change, and you achieved that change, because the NDP amendment that was put forward to delete the offending sections from the bill was passed, and that is a victory for the airsoft community. All they are asking for is not the sledgehammer approach of legislation that was in the original version of C-21, but a regulatory approach. They are more than willing to work with government on a regulatory approach. That message was heard, and that is something that I think all parliamentarians can celebrate. Now, let me turn to the handgun freeze and the amendment that we attempted to expand the exceptions of the handgun freeze to allow for other sport shooting disciplines. So, you know, as the bill is currently written at this third reading stage, Mr. Speaker, the only exemptions that exist, you know, I use exemptions and exceptions interchangeably, means the same thing, but it's limited to people who are at an extremely elite level, to Olympic athletes and Paralympic athletes. I felt, after speaking to members of my community who participate in the International Practical Shooting Confederation, I've spoken to members who are in single action shooting as well, I felt that, you know, these are athletes. They train for what they do. They're passionate about their sport, and they deserve to have exemptions as well. So I put forward an amendment to try and expand that. That amendment almost did pass. There was a little bit of a confusion on the Liberal side when that amendment came to a vote. And you know, when I tuned in to watch the committee hearing at that stage, I was pleasantly surprised to see the Liberal member for Kings Hants speaking in support of our amendment. And it was a wonderful surprise to see, except that when it came to a vote, unfortunately he abstained. It resulted in a 5-5 tie, which of course had to be broken by the Liberal chair. So we came really close. Now, I've received a lot of flack from certain sectors of society for my stance on this, and that's okay. I can take it. I'm not going to apologize for standing in here and making an attempt to fix the bill on behalf of my constituents who simply want to be able to practice their sport. And to those you know, who are arguing against that, I would simply point to the submission that was given to our committee by none other than the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. They said, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, "We believe that a handgun freeze is one method of reducing access to these types of firearms while allowing existing law-abiding handgun owners to practice their sport." So that's what I was basing my amendment on, that and the interventions made by my constituents. We tried our best at committee to make that change. Unfortunately, due to the votes falling the way they did with the Liberals in the bloc, it unfortunately did not pass. And I'll give you another reason, Mr. Speaker. You know, the top IPSC competitors were telling me that they shoot about 50,000 rounds of ammunition a year. I mean, that's an incredible amount. And you have to understand that, you know, a handgun is essentially a mechanical device. And if you're shooting it 50,000 times a year, they break down. And sometimes they have to be replaced. And in my mind, it wasn't fair allowing an exception for an athlete at that caliber to have the means to be able to replace a tool that they use to compete. So we may have lost this particular battle, but I can tell people who are members of those sport shooting disciplines that I will continue to pursue this issue. I will find other avenues to fight to make sure that your sport has an exemption. So we have completed the report stage part of this bill. Mr. Speaker, I also want to talk, because there has been some controversy from some women's groups who were unhappy with the red flag provisions of the law. I understand that. I mean, when I approached the committee hearings on this, I understood the controversy that existed around red flag. There were some women's groups that felt that adding this extra layer of bureaucracy through the court system did not serve women and people who were in vulnerable situations where firearms might be present, that we should have a properly equipped and responsive police force. And I agree with them. But I will turn critics, I'll turn their attention to the National Association of Women in the Law, because when C-21 was reported back to the House, they let out, they stated some public tweets. They're all up there for people to read. And they said that with all of the amendments that were proposed, these are some of the ways that it's going to make women safer. Number one, the provision on license revocation when someone has committed violence is now strengthened and clarified. A license must be revoked when there are reasonable grounds to suspect that an individual may have engaged in family violence. People who have been subject to a protection order will now be ineligible to hold a license if they could pose a threat or risk to the safety of another person. This way, safety comes first, and that is the onus test. The bill also it did have no timelines to reacting to danger or domestic violence. Thanks to the adoption of some of their recommendations and amendments, there's now a statutory duty to act within 24 hours. This is going to serve to protect women at a critical time of separation when the risk of violence is at its highest. So, a lot about this bill has been subsumed by the debate over hunting rifles and shotguns, over airsoft and the handgun freeze. And it's important for us to realize that there are actually in the heart of the bill some very important measures which have now been improved by the committee. And I'm proud, if the National Association of Women in the Law, I've worked with this organization, I respect the submissions that they've made. If they're willing to come out and publicly endorse the bill in this way, I'm glad to have their support as a stakeholder, and I give it a lot of credence. I also, Madam Speaker, want to talk about ghost guns. A lot has been talked about that. That's another sort of unsung hero part of this bill. We heard from law enforcement, and I want to read into the record the testimony that came from Inspector Michael Rowe, who is a staff sergeant of the Vancouver Police Department. He said, quote, "In addition to what is already included in Bill C-21, I would ask that this committee to consider regulating the possession, sale, and importation of firearms parts used to manufacture ghost guns, such as barrels, slides, and trigger assemblies. These parts are currently lawful to purchase and possess without a license, and they can be purchased online or imported from the United States. The emergence of privately made firearms has reduced the significance of currently regulated receivers and increased the importance of currently unregulated gun parts that are needed to finish a 3D printed receiver and turn it into a functioning firearm." So that is the request coming from law enforcement. We know this is a growing problem, and they asked for a specific legislative fix to this problem. I'm proud to see that the Public Safety Committee delivered on that request from law enforcement. I'll end here, Madam Speaker. Much has been said about Indigenous communities. They are, of course, the ones who led the way in opposition to this bill. I remember in December when the Assembly of First Nations came out with a unanimous emergency resolution opposing those 11th hour amendments that were made by the Liberal government. They went against the spirit of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and they helped us understand as parliamentarians that these are not toys, they are not hobbies, they are ways of life. And in some Indigenous communities, they are necessary for the protection of life. I'm glad to see that the committee listened no current make or model of a rifle or shotgun that is currently in use in Indigenous communities is touched by C-21. And the committee went further and added a clause which now references Section 35 of the Constitution Act to show that Indigenous rights are upheld. So I'll conclude, Madam Speaker, by saying that I can honestly go back to the hunters, farmers, and Indigenous communities in my riding, Couch and Malahat Langford, and say, your currently owned firearms are safe. I'm glad we were able to force the government's hand on this matter, and that's where I'll conclude. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments?